go. Right. So we've got time for questions. So does anyone have any questions?
Questions or stories? You know, stories are good.
Do you want to take them one by one, or do you want?
Yeah, no, let's take them one by one, and
Okay.
if we begin to get more, we can take 2 or 3 at a
Absolutely.
time. Yeah, hi.
Hi,
how
I
are
can
you?
start. I don't have a question, but I have a story. Your talk
Oh, let's
was,
hear it.
yeah, your talk was amazing. I'm from Afghanistan. In my family, I feel though my dad was involved with the Mujahideen, so we were militarized from the very beginning. And my granddad was part of a, like he was the elder in the province, so he was involved in decision making in things like the tribal society. But in my lifetime, I think we became really militarized when my uncle was a commander in the Taliban. And then because of that, we had to support, we didn't necessarily support the Taliban because of his involvement, because of he being there with the whole family, we had to support him and support the regime. And then later on, when the Taliban government collapsed, we became demilitarized. But then now somehow, because like things has happened in between, we're going back to militarization because to take revenge or to stand against the American occupation. So in Afghanistan, it's really interesting. And also, women's, like my mother has to go through so much suffering and pain because of my father and my uncle's involvement. And no one really cares about how the woman feels. It's just about the men and more towards
How does your
militarized.
mother make sense of that? Because most of you hear the gist of it. How does your mother express if she does it all, you know, what she's gone through, or how she makes sense of what she's been made to go through?
I think she feels as though that it's her moral duty and responsibility to care for her husband, for her sons, and for her brother-in-law. It's just like the way it is. You should support it and not speak up against it, even though it's wrong, even though the the children are the one who suffer the most, and there's no one really questioning that, which is a bit unfortunate.
Oh, and it's very hard. I mean, if you can militarize caring, right, then how do you withdraw caring in the name of being opposed to militarism? Because you're not withdrawing caring from the elite, you're not withdrawing caring from the government, you're not withdrawing caring even from a certain commander of a larger militia, you're withdrawing caring from your own husband. That is really the ingenious way to militarize people, right? Because it's not that your mother has kind of bought a whole package of militarized ideas, but she's been kind of positioned where it doesn't seem like there's a way to disentangle her wifely responsibilities and her caring from, in fact, a militarized role.
And just another point.
Yeah,
like,
it's really interesting.
in Afghanistan, like a lot of people go into the army and police not because they want to go, but because of financial reasons.
Oh, yes.
And then the family doesn't really support the government or the way the army or militarization works, but they do because their life depends on it. They survive because of that, whatever money they get.
Yeah.
And then when the soldier dies, no one really cares. It's like it's not like the UK and the West where they're seen as they're really honored. It's just like you die basically. It's not a big deal.
But also the salary ends. I mean, and we shouldn't imagine that in the West that money doesn't matter. In fact, a lot of young people go into a lot of militaries because of the salary. Or if not the salary, well, partly the salary, but also the monetary benefits you'll get after you've done your tour of duty in the form of education benefits, which is money. And so, and it's one of the reasons why ISIS is now paying, I forget how much a month. They've got a salary scale, and most of the militias that I've heard of in Syria, the competing militias, but also the militias in 2006, 2007, 2008 in Iraq, they all paid salaries. And one of the reasons that, as you say, a lot of people, young people especially, join because, in fact, particularly if the war has decimated the economy and all other job opportunities, then joining a militia, you may or may not really care what the militia is fighting for, but the fact is you're bringing in a weekly salary, and that weekly salary may go to your parents. Right? That's really, just even that one family over time is a world. Yeah? Thank you for that.
I think the gentleman with the camera
Should we have some women first?
Well,
Now that we.
is that part of the militarization?
Yeah, right.
Well,
Just
yeah.
go for it.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. Wonderful speech. In 1988, there was a documentary / reconstruction of a British Falklands veteran. It was about Tumbledown. And there was a lot of fuss made that the BBC was almost traitorous by admitting that some people had come back brain damaged. And his wife was interviewed about the role of caring for him. But what's interesting to me is the way that damaged bodies used to be hidden, but are now, via the Paralympics, and I'm thinking especially of the amputees, mobilised in the service of the state. And I think that's partly because the technology has come on with prosthetics, which I used to do. So you can now function with no legs, and you can walk on 2 prosthetic limbs. And I'm wondering if there's any work done maybe in the United States, because the Veterans Administration is far bigger, has far more experience of this going back at least to Vietnam, of the way that damaged warriors' bodies are mobilised.
Actually, the expert on this is here at Manchester. It's Anna Carden-Coyne, who is here on the faculty of the University of Manchester, and she has a book for sale at the Art Gallery downtown. Am I pointing in the right direction? Downtown. It's called Wounded Bodies. And what Anna did, Anna's not here today, is she, by chance? Anna Carden-Coyne, what she's done is she started with World War I. And what she looked at, it was just so mind-expanding for me. She looked at all the people that were caring for the most grievously injured men who came back from the front, British men. And what she looked at is the debates and the negotiations amongst the following: the surgeons, the physical therapists, because physical therapy is a profession that came out of managing wounded male soldiers in World War I. There's a very interesting militarized history. It doesn't mean all physical therapists are militarized, but that history is. Physical therapists, physicians, nurses, and the male and female members of the family to whom this male wounded soldier was going to return. And that those, I think she probably has, and the media, so at least 6, they all were negotiating, debating, tugging against each other about what to make of this wounded, now it's alliterative in English, wounded warrior, right? That's why W works so well. And so what she has done is taken that on to Cambodia, where of course there's a very high number of Cambodians, men and women, and children who've been killed by buried landmines, right? And looked also at the Iraq and Afghanistan current wars to try and understand what does that debate amongst not just the person who's wounded, but the person who, the people, and it takes a team, that are supposed to care for them, but also relate to them. How do they relate to them? Do they relate to them as lesser people now? Do they relate to them as people who are incapacitated? The Pentagon, you can go on, in fact, go to woundedwarriors.com or something, .org, but go onto the Pentagon site, and there is a whole site about those soldiers who have become amputees, women and men, who, in fact, rebuild their lives thanks to the wonders of technology, right? The one person that I tried to follow was a woman named Danielle Green, an African-American woman who was a basketball star when she was in university at Notre Dame University, which is one of the big sports universities in the United States, Catholic university. And she became known as not just lefty, left something. She was fabulous. She was a left-handed basketball player. And she joined the military because she'd gone through ROTC as a way to pay for college. And so she went into the military. She became part of the militarized police the Army police. She went to Iraq in the earlier years. She was up on a rooftop and she was grievously wounded and she lost her left arm. And this is the story of, when I tried to make sense of the Iraq War, I decided to write a book that was about 4 Iraq women and how differently they coped with, strategized about, experienced, made sense of the Iraq War, and 4 American women. And Danielle was one of the 4 American women. And to see the ways in which she made sense of not just her wound, but in fact her joining the military, how she thinks now about her role. She's a professional educator in Chicago. But it is true that the military establishment really wants to valorize wounded soldiers who come back and are able to play manly sports, right? And the Pentagon has an enormous stake in men who have been seriously wounded, being able to prove that they can still act like, in American contemporary warped terms, manly men, and that's oftentimes through sport. So if you look at the American teams at the Paralympics, a very high percentage of the American team, I don't know if it's true of the British team, but of the American team, a very high percentage of the athletes are in fact soldiers who've come back losing a limb. Yeah.
We had a question there at the
Oh,
back.
absolutely. Hi there. Hi. Yes, you.
Well, there was someone there as well before, but
Look, we have time. You go, and then you go, okay?
It's great to be in the room with you.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I'm someone who's been a bit obsessed with advertising for the British military for some years, and as everyone will know, the British Army is not a conscript army; it's a professional army. And so I wonder if you could comment perhaps on whether this, the binary between militarization and demilitarization is perhaps, it's certainly, or maybe it's not a continuum, and it's certainly not as dichotomous, it seems to me, from my analysis of the imagery used, precisely because of the ways in which the promotional materials to join the British Army are about having a great time and having a great career, and very little about what armies do, apart from perhaps kind of war game videos. So, I mean, maybe other people have other perceptions. There's certainly a great deal about gender in them, but it seems to me that that in a sense the bureaucratization of war and that the boundary between war and non-war becoming so blurred in so many ways that the promotional material for the British Army has long since abandoned simply being in great action movie mode, but being very, very specialised in particular kind of professional trajectories.
I think it's and it's true of the US military too, and it's also true of the Swedish military, which is now in high advertising mode. And that is that in some ways it's a testimony to how the MOD or the Pentagon or the Swedish Defense Ministry or the Canadian Defense Ministry, it's a testimony to how much they don't think that 17, 18, and 19-year-old Britons are very militarized. So in some ways, the lure is not a lure offered to people they think are highly militarized and will be appealed to by that. It's a testimony, really, to their presumption that we'll have to militarize you once you get in. But where you are now, walking on the high street or riding the bus or the tube, that in fact you're not highly militarized, and that won't be very appealing. In the specialization features is that, of course, this is a country, as is the US, where it's very hard to get a job. So, I mean, back in the 1980s, the American military had a whole campaign that said you'll learn how to drive construction vehicles, right? They would show you on big Caterpillar earth diggers, right, for the military, which said, join the military because we will train you in something you can use when you get out to earn a living as a civilian. Now, a lot of veterans will say, well, actually, I never got close to, you know, a piece of construction equipment, and I wouldn't know how to drive a Caterpillar if I had to. But that is the lure. The Swedish, Gabe was great and mentioned that I was in Sweden in June and asked to take part in a huge, it was a wonderful event, huge Nordic women's forum. 3,000 women, I think, maybe more, 5,000 women. And they were from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and this is why it's Nordic, because those three countries, they speak some variety of Scandinavian, and Iceland, and Finland, which is why you have to call it Nordic, not Scandinavian, right? So, I know you all thought about that. But anyway, but what was really interesting was to hang out with Swedish feminists during part of the time, and they are alarmed at what they think is the militarization of Sweden. And Sweden is one of those countries that most of us lump together with Switzerland as having a foreign policy that is dedicated to neutrality when the great powers go to war. But in fact, Sweden now, this is the term in English used by the Swedish feminists, they say Sweden is becoming NATOized. And Sweden sent troops to Afghanistan to serve under NATO commanders. Putin, they say, Vladimir Putin, is God's gift to the Swedish militarizers because he and his aggressiveness has really legitimized the language of the world is dangerous. And we cannot just protect ourselves, we need to be under the NATO umbrella. So the roles of Putin's aggressiveness, first in Georgia, then in the Crimea, now in eastern Ukraine, is playing its way out in various Scandinavian and Baltic countries quite differently and quite interestingly. Most recently, about a month ago, maybe I have my dates wrong, maybe 2 months ago, Norway, the Norwegian parliament, by overwhelming majority, voted to institute conscription for women. Norway. And it was done with the support of the Social Democrats and the Socialists, as well as the Conservative Party. And it was done in the name of two things together. That if men are going to be conscripted, women should be conscripted. That's what gender equality looks like in Norway. That was one argument. And the second argument, watch this now, never take anything that's simultaneous as if it's not related. The second argument was with the Russian militarized aggression in Eastern Europe, we have to have as strong, meaning as smart, that's what they all said, a military as possible, and you can't do that if you just have men. That's funny. But it was a double argument, an argument for let's do real gender equality by making sure women and men both had to do time in the military, although in reality very small proportions of Norwegian men are actually ever called to serve, and even smaller proportions of women will be called to serve, but the reality, the ideology is both should serve. But it comes at a time when there is a sense that Sweden needs to be even closer than it already is becoming to NATO because of the seeming threat in the East. You can go online, a lot of it has been translated into English, and watch the Norwegian feminist debate over this law that was debated in Parliament and then recently passed. So I think in terms of the advertising in countries that are not, who see themselves as not highly militarized, will in fact now look more militarized. But those that are already quite militarized, like Britain and the United States, they still have to sell it to people who they don't think are very militarized, and their parents. And thus the construction, you know, and the specialized training and so on. Somebody, yes, there you go, hi.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm very intrigued with your examples concerning the Kurdish women. But
Yes.
I'd like to push this a little bit further.
Yes, please.
So if you're a Kurdish woman in Syria or Iraq, in the present situation where these territories are under threat from the Islamic State, isn't in a situation like that, are your women's rights in fact more under threat if your community is demilitarizing? So I guess I'm wondering whether in your model of militarization there's sort of an assumption that all regions in the world would kind of have the chance to work out like Costa Rica and El Salvador, when maybe there's, you know, there could be all sorts of other factors.
And in fact, I don't think that Kurdish Syrian women and Turkish Kurdish women, reverse that, but Kurdish women in Turkey and Kurdish women in Syria do not see themselves in exactly the same positions. Right? ISIS has not taken any Kurdish or Turkish territory in Turkey, right? Whereas now in Kobane is in Syria, there is enormous sense of an instant kind of danger of takeover. So I think this is why militarization really is something that is not, you're absolutely right with your warning, it's not a cookie cutter to be kind of imposed. One needs to really listen to how actual people make these difficult calculations, you know, and they will, everybody always is trying to think, well, what is real security? What's short-term security? What's long-term security? Will we make choices that will entrench male privilege even after the war is over? Or can we participate in a masculinized operation in a way that opens up space for women's agency? Well, those things, you know, you just can't say yes or no, just as you said. I think what the Khmer women have said, because they felt, I mean, the Kurdish population in Turkey felt very much under threat. I went to a dinner that the Khmer is wonderful. They've opened up restaurants so that women can learn how to run restaurants. Kurdish women run restaurants, so they have wonderful public restaurants, open restaurants. And they closed down the restaurant after hours. We had a dinner. And this was because I was invited by a Turkish feminist who's become very trusted with the Khmer activists. But one of the most moving moments was they closed down the restaurant. We'd all had wine and great lentil food. It was great. And then at the very end, over coffee, some of the Khmer women began to sing Kurdish songs. Now the thing is, what Aisha, my feminist friend who invited me to this, said, do you realize that until recently it was illegal to sing in Kurdish? So to sing Kurdish songs and not think that the police are going to break in or that you're going to be arrested because somebody heard you singing on the street was remarkable. But those women in Khmer, and they've made many more decisions than they would ever give me privy to, but they have tried to figure out a way to be distinct from the PKK. And they did it when they were under siege from the Turkish military. I can't imagine quite how you do that. That doesn't mean that their situation, say, in 2003, was the same as for Syrian Kurdish women in Kobane, right? There are women in the Peshmerga being the Iraqi Kurdish militia. And the Peshmerga, if you listen to Iraqi Kurdish women, And you can read things by all of them. A lot of things get translated. If you listen to Iraqi Kurdish feminists talk, they don't assume that women's participation in the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurdish militia, is the same as women's rights or women's security in the Iraqi part of Kurdistan. So then you watch them negotiating with not just the Peshmerga, but those women who join the Peshmerga. Right? And it's not at all certain that every woman who joins the Peshmerga really will stand up for all the full range of women's rights that Kurdish feminists are calling for, especially around violence against women in the family. Right? But I think your warning is such a good one. Keep your feet on the ground, right? One of the things you learn as a feminist is you have to really embrace complexity, right? And to be complex doesn't mean to be vague, right? To be complex means you know that relationships are fluid, you know they're multi-sided, and you're game. You can listen to that, you can take that on board, and you can watch things over time. Yes, I saw somebody. Yes, hi, how are you?
Recently in Britain, there's been young girls that were British born, the ones from Manchester, the Somali twins.
Oh, yes.
They have gone to allegedly become jihadi brides in Syria. So most of the examples that you've given are based on regions, so the feminists identify with other feminists. But mainly this happening in Britain, where they don't relate with other girls or other Somalians here, but in a region or in a country that they've not been to before. How would that be explained?
And one, we have to ask them. I mean, really, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that we know, I mean, certainly the British tabloids have acted as though thousands of Muslim British women have gone, right? All they need is two, right, to make a story, right? I've been just struck by how much this very small number of young women making this decision has been turned into kind of a scare story for all of Britain. I mean, that's militarization, by the way. If anything that tries to make you more fearful than you realistically should is trying to militarize you. But I think what's interesting, of course I don't know anything about these two young women, but what we do know, and we don't know enough, but what we do know is that the men who lead ISIS, and ISIS is a highly patriarchal organization, but unlike some other militias, not all, there are some militias that share this, but ISIS, because it has a very strong notion of what patriarchal order, patriarchal good society should look like, puts an enormous stake in marriage. That is, marriage, the unmarried militiaman is not the ideal for their perfect society. So marriage is very salient for ISIS wherever it's occupying, in Mosul or other Raqqa and other places. So what really is interesting to me is that the ISIS male leaders have tried to organize some system whereby women outside of Syria and Iraq can come and fulfill this marriage agenda that ISIS has. What their experience will be, what they'll make of their experience, I mean, we just don't know. But it is true that marriage is always salient to any militarized force. Always ask the marriage question. About any military you know and don't love. Always ask the marriage question. And with ISIS, what is striking to me is they're trying to create an entire society, right? They're not just trying to gain territory. And their notion, from what little we know, but they talk about it a lot, is that a conventional patriarchal marriage is one of the keystones to the society they're trying to create. So it's not surprising to me that they are actually trying to find wives for their fighters. What we know from other militias, and there's at least a couple of examples from ISIS, is the marriage doesn't always have to be voluntary. So you'll notice that in the, oh, we've got stuff.
We can run over a little bit.
Yeah, but you all have lives. See, I do notice. But one of the things that is really striking, hi, thanks a lot. No, it's great, that's great. But one of the things that you will notice in the Rome Statute, now the Rome Statute, as all of your professors are trying to teach you, the Rome Statute is the international, but that means interstate, agreement that set up the permanent war crimes courts in The Hague. Right? That's called the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute has many, many parts in smaller and smaller print. But feminists were in Rome. Rhonda Copeland, there are a bunch of them, were in Rome when that was being negotiated. Of course, they didn't get formal delegation status, but they were there to persuade any delegate they could as to what should, this is about marriage, what should go into the Rome Statute. Because in the Rome Statute is spelled out what is defined as a war crime. And the feminists, this transnational small group of feminists that lobbied in Rome around the Rome Statute language managed to get in that forced abortion was a war crime and that forced giving birth was a war crime, and that people, women who were forced to become sexual partners to fighting men could not be called wives, they had to be called sex slaves. And when you see that language in the Rome Treaty, that's to demystify what happens to forced sexual relations considered by the fighters marriage, actually what it should be called, and that it should be prosecutable. So sometime spend a little time, or have a group of you, and each of you take a different part, and figure out where the feminists in Rome, in those hotel corridors, working long, long, long hours, where did they manage to get some language in? And that was very specific, particularly around wives, and that language should not be used. They should be called sex slaves if they're involuntarily made to be sexual partners of fighters. They should not be called marriages, and they themselves should not be called wives. That's called success. On that note, thank you very much.